The 16th century knew no mercy. It was an age of iron and fire, a world where justice was not inked upon parchment, but seared into flesh, branded on skin, displayed in the open squares for all to see. It was an age where rulers believed that fear was stronger than law, and fear was crafted in spectacles of blood. Courts were mere shadows, words but whispers. The true language of power was written with steel blades, burning irons, and the cries of the condemned. In this world, to fall into the hands of justice was not to die swiftly. It was to be broken, to be unmade, to serve as a sermon carved upon the body for the multitude who watched. For rebels, for traitors, for the poor who dared to lift their heads against the order of lords and princes. Death alone was never enough. Death was too gentle, too silent. Pain had to precede it. Pain had to sing. Pain had to become the theater in which terror was the lesson and obedience the only applause. The camera sweeps across Europe, across kingdoms weighed down by the smoke of war and the cries of revolt, until it descends into the stone heart of a dungeon. Torchlight flickers upon the walls, casting monstrous shadows that sway like specters of past victims. The air is heavy with damp and iron, thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and rotting straw. Here the walls themselves seem to breathe with centuries of agony. The rack waits at the center, not a mere instrument but a beast carved from oak and rope, groaning with anticipation. Its beams are stained with the memory of countless bodies stretched upon it. Its wheels creak as though eager for another confession, another soul to tear apart. Into this chamber, bound in chains, Hans Müller is dragged. His clothes are torn, his back lashed raw from whips, his face swollen from fists and boots. He stumbles forward, his chains clinking like the toll of a funeral bell. He is no longer a leader of men, no longer the voice that rallied peasants to rise against their lords. He is prey, offered to the machine of torment. The executioners grip him with hands calloused by cruelty, their eyes cold, their movements methodical. They tie his wrists and ankles to the rack, securing each knot with practiced precision. For them, this is not a crime. It is craft. It is duty. It is theater. The wheel turns, the ropes pull. Hans's body jerks violently, arms wrenched from their sockets, tendons stretching like bowstrings ready to snap. His jaw clenches, teeth grinding, but soon the first scream erupts, raw and primal, echoing against the stone. Bloodshot eyes bulge, veins swell in his neck. His chest heaves as the ropes drag him further, inch by inch. The sound of sinews snapping fills the chamber, a grotesque music of bones and flesh in rebellion against their own destruction. Every pull is a question. Every stretch is a demand. Names they hiss. Conspirators they shout. Betrayal they command. Yet Hans answers with nothing but blood spat upon the floor, defiance dripping from his mouth like a curse hurled against the powers that torment him. The rack groans again, the wheel grinding mercilessly forward. His body is contorted beyond the limits of nature, limbs bent in directions that no human frame should endure. His screams rise once more, long and piercing, a cry that is both man and beast, both agony and resistance. One executioner pauses, wiping sweat from his brow, not from pity but from exertion, before tightening the ropes again. They will not stop until his body betrays his spirit, until his will is shattered as completely as his limbs. The dungeon swallows his cries, but they linger, seared into the air, etched upon the memory of stone. The camera lingers on his face, a mask of agony, yet beneath it a flicker of something unbroken. This is the cost of defiance, the price that rebellion pays when it dares to challenge the throne. The rack strains, the prisoner quivers, the chamber vibrates with his suffering, and then beyond the dungeon's heavy doors, another sound emerges. A drum beat, slow, steady, inevitable. It is the summons for the spectacle above, the rhythm that calls the people to gather. The torture chamber and the scaffold are but two stages of the same theater. Here he is broken. There he will be displayed. And as Hans Müller's final scream fades, it merges with the beat of that drum, carrying his torment upward, out of the darkness, into the square where thousands wait to learn the lesson written in his pain. The square was already overflowing, a cauldron of breath and murmurs beneath a gray and heavy sky. Word of an execution traveled faster than fire through dry straw, and in the villages surrounding the city, the peasants had streamed in with hesitant steps. Some came driven by fear, compelled by the knowledge that absence itself might be questioned. Others came out of morbid curiosity, drawn to the spectacle of death as moths are drawn to a flame. For in this age, executions were not private punishments hidden in dungeons. They were public sermons, crafted to teach, to terrify, to shape obedience. The scaffold was not merely a stage, it was a pulpit, and the condemned body was scripture written in blood. Men jostled against men, women clutched their children close, pressing against the wooden barriers erected by soldiers who guarded the perimeter. The halberds of those soldiers caught the dull light, glinting like a wall of steel teeth. Behind them the scaffold rose stark and bare, planks darkened by countless stains, steps worn smooth by the passage of other condemned. It stood like a second church in the heart of the square, one that preached not salvation, but fear. The drums rolled, a deep and steady heartbeat, summoning silence out of chaos. Every roll echoed like the toll of a bell, reminding all that a lesson was about to begin. Executions were sermons written in flesh, the voice of history intones. The people were not only witnesses, they were pupils. Every broken body was a warning, every severed head a scripture of obedience. And so they watched, though many wished to look away. Mothers pressed trembling hands against their children's eyes, yet the little ones peeked through trembling fingers. Young men, who had whispered of rebellion in barns and fields, now felt the chill of what rebellion truly cost. Old men, who had seen too many such mornings, stood in grim silence, their faces stone but their eyes wet. The crowd was not one body but 1,000 hearts beating unevenly, torn between pity, fear, and an unspoken anger that dared not rise to the lips. Then he appeared, Hans Müller. Dragged forward by chains, his frame broken by torture, yet his spirit still clinging stubbornly to life. His body trembled with each step, shoulders hunched from the rack's cruel embrace, legs stiff, arms twisted, bruises blooming dark upon his flesh. But still, he raised his head. Still, he forced his gaze upward, as though to deny the executioners the victory of seeing him bowed. His eyes scanned the sea of peasants below, those same men and women who had once looked to him for guidance, who had whispered his name as a beacon of hope. Now they looked back with horror, sorrow, and guilt. Some averted their gaze, unable to meet the eyes of the man who had dared to lead them, ashamed of their silence. Others stared openly, tears slipping down their faces, their grief mingled with helplessness. A few whispered prayers, their lips moving soundlessly, prayers that would never reach heaven, for heaven in that moment seemed deaf. Among them were children, eyes wide and uncomprehending. Yet these images would burn into their memories forever, shaping how they understood power, justice, and defiance. The soldiers held him fast, forcing him up the steps of the scaffold. Each creak of the timber seemed to echo across the hushed square. It was not the sound of wood, but of fate itself, bending beneath the weight of history. The executioner stood waiting, his face hidden beneath the hood, his axe glinting with deadly anticipation. But it was not the executioner the crowd watched. It was Hans, the man who had risen from the fields to challenge lords, now reduced to a broken figure climbing toward death. This was the ritual of power, to display not merely a body, but a soul crushed beneath the machinery of authority, to show that no voice, however loud, could rise against princes and live. And so the crowd learned, as all crowds were meant to, obedience through terror, silence through spectacle. Yet within the silence there was something else, faint and dangerous. Memory. The peasants saw not only a condemned traitor, but their own reflection upon the scaffold. They saw hunger, desperation, and the desire for justice. They saw the price of daring to dream. And though they trembled, though their lips spoke no words of defiance, their eyes absorbed the image of Hans Müller, bruised, broken, yet unbowed. The drums ceased. The square held its breath. The lesson was about to be carved into flesh. The scaffold was not yet drenched in blood, but already it was heavy with expectation. Upon that wooden platform, the machinery of power moved with ritual precision. The herald stepped forward, his gloved hands clutching a parchment that trembled not from fear, but from the weight of words sharpened into weapons. He unfurled it slowly, deliberately, letting the sound of crackling vellum carry across the hushed square. Every eye fixed upon him, every ear strained to catch the judgment that would soon become history. The words thundered out: rebellion, treason, blasphemy against the sacred order of lords and princes. Each charge rolled into the air like the stroke of a hammer upon an anvil. These were not mere accusations. They were incantations of authority, spoken to crush not just the man who stood before them, but the spirit of all who watched. The herald's voice swelled with ceremony, yet behind its grandeur lay a simple truth. Hans Müller had dared to dream of justice, and for that alone, the sentence was death. But as the accusations poured forth, their weight began to falter. The words, though grand, dissolved into the uneasy silence of the crowd. No roar of approval came, no cry of condemnation. Instead, a restless stillness spread like fog across the square. The people understood what the parchment proclaimed, but they also understood the man it condemned. They knew the hunger that had driven him, the poverty that had armed him, the desperate hope that had made him dangerous. And so the words, however loud, found no echo. They hung in the air, brittle, fragile, unable to drown the truth that lived unspoken in the people's hearts. Hans stood, his body broken by torture, his chains biting into bruised flesh. Yet from the ruin of his frame, something remained unbroken: his will. He raised his head, his lips moving, and though his voice was cracked and ragged, it cut through the silence like a blade. He spoke not of crowns nor of princes, but of bread and dignity. He named not ambition, but survival. And in that moment, the charges of treason and rebellion were stripped bare, revealed for what they were: the fear of rulers confronted by the cries of the ruled. The voiceover lingers: if that is treason, then let history condemn him, not the steel. For in the eyes of the hungry, rebellion is not betrayal, it is necessity. And in the eyes of the desperate, dignity is worth more than life itself. But history does not pause to weigh such truths upon the scaffold. The guards, unmoved, pressed him to his knees, their hands cold and mechanical. The gesture was not personal, it was ritual. They were merely cogs in a wheel far larger than themselves, enforcers of a judgment already decided before parchment met ink. The crowd shuddered as Hans sank down, a broken man made to kneel before the blade that would erase him. The executioner stepped forward. His axe gleamed under the pale, uncertain light, its edge polished to a cruel perfection. It was more than steel, it was the embodiment of authority, sharpened into obedience. The crowd inhaled sharply, as if one breath bound them all together. Mothers clutched children tighter. Men shifted uneasily upon their feet. Somewhere a prayer rose, swallowed by the silence. This was condemnation made flesh, a man upon his knees, a weapon poised above him, a people forced to watch. In that tableau, power revealed its true face, not in words, not in laws, but in the ability to silence forever the voice that dared to speak. And so the stage was set. The parchment had done its work. The crowd had heard the charges, the condemned had spoken his truth, and the executioner now held the final word. The square, once restless, now stilled entirely, waiting for the moment when silence would break in a single, irreversible stroke. The drums began to roll, their sound deep and unrelenting, like thunder echoing through the hollow sky. Each beat was a nail driven into silence, each strike a summons to witness. The crowd froze, a single body made of countless hearts, each one pounding against the cage of the chest. Every murmur died, every whisper fell away. The square became a vast chamber of breath held and voices stilled, awaiting the stroke that would transform man into memory. Upon the scaffold, Hans Müller was forced down. The chains clinked as his knees struck the rough timber, the sound small against the booming drum, yet sharper, more human. Guards pressed his shoulders, pushing his broken frame toward the block. His head was lowered, pressed into the hollow of oak worn smooth by the weight of others who had knelt there before him. The block was not wood alone. It was a relic, baptized in blood, consecrated in pain, its grooves stained with the history of countless condemned. The camera slows, lingering upon the faces in the crowd. A child buries her face in her mother's cloak, only to peek with frightened eyes through the folds of fabric, too young to comprehend, too human to look away. An old man, weathered as the fields he has plowed, whispers a prayer, his lips trembling with words that vanish into the cold air. His eyes close, not from devotion, but from sorrow, as if he might shield his soul from what it must endure. Men stand rigid, jaws clenched, while women grip trembling hands, torn between pity and terror. The square is alive, yet it feels as though the world itself has stopped, holding its breath at the brink of violence. The executioner steps forward. His face is hidden beneath the hood, his body wrapped in coarse cloth, but the weight of his presence is undeniable. In his hands gleams the axe, polished and sharpened, its blade catching the pallid light. The weapon is both tool and symbol, steel shaped into authority, cold and unquestionable. The executioner's muscles tighten, his stance deliberate, practiced. He has done this before and will do it again. Yet every stroke carries the weight of permanence. For when the blade falls, there is no reversal, no reprieve, no second chance. The drums cease. Silence crashes down, heavier than sound, thicker than stone. The executioner raises the axe high, the steel arching above his head, glinting like a crescent moon of death. Time stretches. In that heartbeat, eternity seems to unfold. The condemned, the crowd, the axe, the block, all bound together in a single moment that trembles on the edge of history. Then the blade falls. A sickening thud rends the silence. Wood shudders beneath the force. A spray of crimson bursts across the straw, staining it with the final truth of rebellion. The head rolls, eyes still half open, frozen between defiance and surrender, as though even in death Hans Müller refuses to close his gaze upon the world that condemned him. The body convulses once, chains rattling, before collapsing into stillness. Gloved hands seize the severed head, lifting it high for all to see. Blood drips from the ragged neck, trailing down the stake, mingling with the straw that drinks it greedily. A roar ripples through the crowd, not of triumph, but of horror, shock, and murmurs that clash against one another like waves in a storm. Mothers weep, children cling, men mutter oaths beneath their breath. Fear has been delivered, swift and merciless, but so too has memory. For in that instant, the lesson is carved into every eye that witnesses it. Rebellion ends in ruin, dignity ends in death. Yet another truth lingers, stubborn and unspoken, that even broken, even silenced, Hans Müller's defiance bleeds into the soil, carried upon the whispers of the crowd. The axe has fallen, but the echo remains. At the city gate, where merchants passed with their carts and peasants trudged with burdens of grain, a new monument rose, one not of stone nor of iron, but of blood and flesh. Upon a tall stake, the severed head of Hans Müller was lifted high, the hair matted, the face pale, the eyes half closed yet fixed in a gaze that seemed to linger still. Blood traced its path downward, dripping across the rough grain of the wood, each drop darkening into the timber, as though sealing a covenant between death and memory. Below his body, stripped of dignity, now headless, was hung like carrion for all to see. The limbs swayed faintly in the breeze, chains rattling against the scaffold, flesh stiffening in the chill of morning. This was no mere execution. It was a spectacle, a ritual of terror meant to live longer than the man himself. His body was transformed into scripture, each wound a verse, each drop of blood a punctuation mark in the sermon of obedience. They killed the man, the voiceover whispers, heavy as tolling bells, but not the symbol. For in every hanging head, the peasants saw their own fate. In every mutilated corpse, they saw the cost of hunger, of defiance, of daring to dream of justice. The crowd lingered. At first, silence wrapped them, thick as shrouds. Some stood rooted, eyes locked upon the head, as though to look away would be to betray the memory of the man who had dared to rise. Others wept quietly, tears sliding down weathered cheeks. Tears not only for him, but for themselves, for the knowledge that the chains binding their lives were stronger than hope. Yet amid the grief, fists clenched in secret, hidden beneath cloaks and shawls, fingers tightening until the knuckles whitened. Rage smoldered, silent but alive, buried where no soldier could see. The soldiers themselves marched proudly across the square, their armor clattering, halberds catching the sun. They believed fear had done its work, that hope had been cut down as surely as Hans Müller's body. They saw bowed heads, trembling hands, and they mistook them for submission. They did not see the glimmers that flickered in the shadows of eyes, the whispers that would pass in barns and taverns long after the drums ceased. Power is blind when it believes terror alone can rule. The gate stood transformed. No longer a threshold of passage, it had become an altar of warning. Every traveler who entered saw the head upon the stake. Every child who left the city carried its image seared into memory. Mothers would whisper, "This is what happens to those who rise." Fathers would mutter, "This is why we keep silent." Yet children would remember differently. They would remember the face of a man who had stood against princes, who had been broken but had not begged. Memory cannot be chained. It seeps into soil, into story, into the marrow of generations. The wind tugged at his garments, the sky heavy with gray clouds. Ravens circled overhead, their cries shrill and merciless, as if mocking both the dead and the living. Yet even as the body was left to rot, even as the blood darkened into the wood, Hans Müller endured, not in flesh, but in the unease that settled upon every witness. The lords had silenced a man, but in so doing, they had given him a permanence that no living voice could achieve. And so the peasants stared upward, silent yet changed. Some wept, others clenched their fists. All carried the image home. The soldiers marched away proud in their certainty. But beneath the surface of that silence, something stirred, something the axe could not sever, something no gallows could contain. For symbols do not die where bodies fall. They take root where memory lingers. And Hans Müller, though headless, would walk still, in whispers, in fears, and in the fragile courage that one day would rise again. The camera pulls back, rising above the scaffold where the body sways in silence, drifting outward beyond the walls of the city. The land stretches wide, rolling German fields, green and golden, bending under the scythe. Farmers stoop once more to the earth, their backs bent as they were before, their hands rough with labor, their eyes lowered to soil that feeds them yet enslaves them. Life resumes, outwardly unchanged. The harvest must still be gathered. The seed must still be sown. Hunger allows no pause, not even for grief. But though the fields return to silence, whispers rise elsewhere. In taverns where ale foams over the rim of wooden cups, the name of Hans Müller is spoken in low voices. In barns thick with hay and dust, where men gather in secret, his story lingers like smoke. In the stillness of night, when only the wind moves through the thatched roofs and distant forests, his memory walks among them, carried from mouth to mouth, from heart to heart. Hans Müller is gone, the voiceover intones, but his name is not. His head may hang in shame, but his story walks among us. The peasants remember. They remember the rack, the scaffold, the gleam of the axe. They remember his body broken, his head lifted high as warning. Yet memory is never obedient. What was meant to terrify begins instead to inspire. The people see not only the ruin of a man, but the courage that led him to rise. They see not only the horror of his death, but the dignity with which he faced it. In this way, the symbol grows greater than the flesh it once inhabited. Children whisper his name as though it were forbidden, a word both dangerous and sacred. Wives tell his story beside the hearth, where firelight flickers across weary faces. Old men murmur of him while sharpening their tools, as though each grind of metal against stone is a prayer. His tale becomes part of the earth itself, sinking into the soil like seed, waiting for a season not yet come. The lords believe they have crushed rebellion, that fear has salted the ground where hope once grew. Yet they cannot see what festers beneath. Fear is a shallow root. Memory burrows deeper. Fear can silence voices, but it cannot erase what the heart recalls in silence. And so rebellion, though beaten, though broken, though scattered across corpses and ashes, lingers. It waits in the pauses between words, in the hunger gnawing at empty bellies, in the rage pressed into clenched fists. In 1525, rebellion was crushed, but rebellion never dies. It waits in silence, in hunger, in memory. The screen fades to black. Silence remains, thick and enduring. Yet even in silence, echoes stir, carrying the story onward.